Wonderful. Thank you, everyone who is trickling in right now. Thank you for joining day 3 of the Dismantle Preservation Unconference. The goal of this event is to amplify conversations that have historically been excluded from traditional preservation conferences and to amplify the work being done by grassroots activists and emerging preservationists of all kinds and all backgrounds. I'm really appreciative of everyone who is taking the time out of their day to be here live, but there are also recordings of all of these sessions, which will be distributed early next week. This event is free thanks to the support of the Alpha Wood Foundation, Eileen and Norman Tyler, and Museum Hack. And if you are so inclined, and I will encourage you, we've selected 5 specific nonprofits and charities for you to donate in lieu of registration cost. These are the Decay Devils, Apache Passion Project, Asian and Pacific Islanders and Historic Preservation, Latinos and Heritage Conservation. And since you all are here today on a conversation on affordability, you may be particularly interested in House of Tulip. House of Tulip is a community development corporation that works to restore old homes and turn them into safe housing for non-binary and trans individuals living in New Orleans. So hopefully you will choose to support one of those groups. If you can't financially, totally fine. Just make sure to like and follow them on social media accounts and maybe sign up for one of their newsletters as well. I'm going to pass the mic over to our Preserving Housing Autonomy panel. If you have questions for these panelists, please throw them into the Q&A box or the chat. Whether you're on YouTube or Zoom, we'll be keeping an eye on those spaces. And I'm really excited for this conversation, and I hope you all are too. So take it away, team.
Well, hello. We would like to welcome you and thank you for being here. Today we'll be talking about affordability and historic preservation and kind of debunk maybe some myths that have been associated with both fields and show that they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, but actually can benefit from one each other. We've seen through the talks we're going to show you today that preservation can be a very useful tool in uplifting spaces around affordability, sustainability, and community building. We'll look into how practitioners integrate preservation into their strategies for housing justice. These strategies include housing cooperatives, community land trust, and tenant organizing, and how to use preservation towards our larger goals of resident empowerment and autonomy. Lindsay, if you want to talk about the flow.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really happy to be here today. My name is Lindsay Mulcahy. Myself and Sydney are going to be lightly facilitating this panel as well as participating with our other really amazing presenters. I think one thing that Sydney and I have, we're both looking for in this panel is ways to intersect these two fields that we haven't necessarily seen in past generations or that there aren't a lot of precedents from. And so we've really been inspired by our peers and those in intersecting fields. So the format of today's panel is going to be kind of lightning round presentations from all 5 panelists talking about their expertise and background in the themes that Sydney mentioned. Then we'll open up and the 5 of us will have a loosely guided discussion around some of the core issues and themes we've raised, and then we'll open it up to you all at the end. So we're going to briefly have the rest of our panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get started with presentations. Caroline, do you want to start us off?
Hi, everyone. My name is Caroline Calderon. I am an assistant project manager with the Little Tokyo Service Center, and I'm also a board member of the Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation.
Camille, do you want to go next? And then we'll have Monique.
Yeah, my name is Camille Nicole. I am a designer and a creative director for Q26. In the past, I've worked with the city of Los Angeles. I've also worked in affordable housing, and I got my degree in heritage conservation from USC.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. My name is Monique, she, her pronouns. I'm a tenant organizer at UHAB and coming to you all from Brooklyn. Glad to be here.
Great. So I think, Sydney, you're going to get us started with a bit of your project, and then we'll go through everyone. All right, let me share your slide.
And while Lindsay's setting that up, I'll briefly introduce myself because I totally forgot to do that. Hi, my name is Andrea Landers. Currently I'm an affordable housing intern with the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Next week, I start with a private consulting firm out here in Los Angeles as a consultant. And I just graduated from UT Austin with my master's in science in historic preservation. This talk that I'll be doing today is kind of briefly overviewing what I actually did for my thesis topic, which is concerning university housing cooperatives in the US through 3 main case studies. All right, so if you want to flip the slide. So these case studies of these university housing cooperatives are based in Ann Arbor, Michigan, Austin, Texas, and Berkeley, California. These organizations, for example, for Austin would be College Houses Cooperative and ICC Austin. Ann Arbor, Michigan has ICC Ann Arbor, and then Berkeley has Berkeley Student Cooperative. So all of these organizations were just chosen as some of the largest and most representative university housing cooperatives in the nation. They are not necessarily the only ones. There are plenty throughout the United States. These were just the largest and most representative that I'll be going over today. And I actually had the opportunity of going out to all of these and being able to see these sites in person. Yeah, next. So just a little overview in Austin. This project actually came out of me living in these cooperatives while I was an undergraduate. I lived in the College Houses Cooperative, so 21st Street Co-op and then Super Co-op for about a year and a half. It kind of emerged from finding the only affordable places in all of Austin, just seeing how the student housing crisis was. That was necessarily pretty much my only option. So this right here is a survey map that I created for all the properties in Austin. A lot of these are interesting because they emerged throughout the 1930s as adaptive reuse cases of historic buildings even then. So some of these buildings, for example, Helios Co-op was an 1880s Queen Anne Victorian home that was readapted in the 1960s and then has been still operating as a cooperative to this day. Yeah, so that's just kind of arraying it. So a lot of these housing situations near the University of Texas are actually incredibly expensive and luxurious, almost matching prices of rent in Manhattan, which is quite ridiculous for Texas, but that's what it is. Next. Next slide. Sorry. And in Ann Arbor, Michigan, here's a property survey map for that, and seeing the urban planning and also zoning laws for a lot of these. It was interesting to see how historically governments have actually suppressed larger residential spaces and where you have more dense housing situations. For example, Ann Arbor, the city had actually put a restriction in which you could only have 4 unrelated people living in one property maximum. So yeah, let's see, next. And then in Berkeley, California, actually BSC had the largest array of properties that I've seen for a single cooperative organization. Sorry. And then for BSC, 19 houses, quite an extensive array of units. Specifically, one of the most interesting ones would be Sherman Hall, and then I think another house were right directly in front of the university's football stadium. So that was an interesting thing to see in terms of zoning, to see whether the university would want to expand and take over that cooperative, if so. Next. In terms of activism, these cooperatives also have very impactful ways in which their tenants have organized to help situations. For example, Luther House, they were organizing for the against the Vietnam War. And a lot of these have historic events have gone through protest. Next. In terms of community, these cooperatives, because people are living in dense areas in which they have communal spaces and that they can't really go from an individual private space into the outside of the building without going through a community space, they kind of form their own communities. And some of these alumni associations are still going from the 1950s till now. Next. So these organizations kind of form their own ways of liberation in which the house structures give every single tenant their own rights and their own say in how the organization proceeds. And interestingly enough, ICC Michigan actually has a lot of origins in the Michigan Socialist Club. Next. So with the cooperatives, since a lot of these organizations started in the 1930s with the start of the Great Depression, a lot of these houses are adaptive reuse from then. In case of the new builds, a lot of them emerged out of the 1970s out of a sheer need for larger density. So the only cases of new builds, which is around 5 buildings out of 50 out of the entire survey, are actually over 200 residents. They can fill up to 200 residents, and we're all funded by HUD loans to keep that going. Next. In terms of stewardship, a lot of these co-ops, because they're run and owned by their own residents, the residents do their own repairs, their own maintenance. So right here you can see one of my favorite pictures of ICC Austin residents painting the roof of New Guild's living room. A lot of how these co-ops work with the education systems, they kind of educate their constituents in how to learn and how to repair their own buildings, and it kind of creates more of a sense of pride when you're that engaged with where you live. Next. Moving forward, so within my thesis, I proposed a 4-part system of archiving, educating, rehabilitating, and designating in a way to help preserve these structures. In terms of archiving, whenever I was doing my own research, I just found that there was a lot of storage closets where I was just sorting through papers. So creating more of a organized archiving method to make sure that their history stays alive. And in terms of education, kind of reamping their education systems on maintenance and creating more education sessions and workshops on how to work with historic buildings more properly. Because whenever I lived there, I did some maintenance, but there were some questionable practices towards the buildings that could be a little bit altered at least. Rehabilitating, of course, a lot of these structures are actually very much eligible for state historic tax credits. For example, in Texas, nonprofits are eligible and they can sell their tax credits, which can help fund their rehabilitation cause. And then designating as a form of preserving the land that they sit on and the building. Next. In terms of resilience, a lot of these structures have lasted a very, very long time. The longest lasting one that I found was Robert Owen Cooperative in Ann Arbor. It had been in operation since 1938. Even through different, I guess, organizational structures, it still operated as a co-op, and it's still going to this day. Next. And just reflecting on it, cooperatives are a very key method of creating tenant empowerment and allowing residents to be actually in charge of their own buildings and be engaged with their own buildings through maintenance. And honestly, living through them changed a lot of who I am as well. So I'm glad to share. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sydney. Caroline, I think we're going to have you go next if you want to share your screen.
Yeah, before I share my screen, I wanted to share, I'm going to be talking about 3 different strategies that I feel like kind of involve historic preservation. When I first, when I was a graduate student at UCLA in the Urban and Regional Planning program, I was an intern for the Asian Pacific Islander Americans in Historic Preservation. And we were planning a conference in San Francisco. And one of the check-in questions during our planning meetings was like, what is like a historic preservation project that you're currently working on? And my answer at that time was, oh, I haven't really done historic preservation. But then over time, like, doing work with API HIP, and then even, the work that I'm doing right now with the Little Tokyo Service Center, I realized that a lot of the things that I was doing at that time was related to historic preservation, but named differently in terms of like ethnic studies, affordable housing, community ownership. So I just wanted to note that as I share these 3 strategies. So the organization that I work for, the Little Tokyo Service Center, is a nonprofit located in the Little Tokyo neighborhood. It's a downtown neighborhood in Los Angeles. And it's a over 100-year-old neighborhood. And part of our work is developing affordable housing in various neighborhoods across LA County. And one of the projects that I wanted to highlight was the Gopher Broke apartments, which will be located on the 1st Street North block in Little Tokyo. The reason why this particular project is very significant is because nearly 80 years ago, this particular block was claimed through eminent domain. It was a block that was primarily occupied pre-World War II by Japanese and Japanese Americans, but during World War II, when Japanese Americans were sent to concentration camps, many of them had, to leave, were owners of these properties and had to leave them behind. And so 80 years later, in March 2021, the city of Los Angeles offered the part of the 1st Street North block, which currently operates as a parking lot, a city parking lot, for the community to have a ground lease for 99 years to be able to develop affordable housing for houseless individuals, particularly veterans, and also low-income households. And at the ground floor of this particular development, there will be commercial spaces that will be targeted to serve legacy businesses, businesses who have been around in Little Tokyo for over 20 years and need affordable space because not all of the land and buildings in Little Tokyo are community owned. And so I want to highlight that this particular project is a product of over decades of community advocacy, to reclaim what was taken from Japanese Americans during World War II. And so it took that long, right? The second project that I wanted to highlight is also another affordable housing project that LTSC is working on in East Hollywood neighborhood of Los Angeles, which will have over 187 units of affordable and permanent supportive housing. And it will be at the corner of Santa Monica and Vermont, adjacent to the Metro Red Line station. The ground floor will also include a food hall, which is also meant to target legacy businesses that have been displaced or are at risk of displacement in the local neighborhood. If you're not familiar with what's happening in East Hollywood, it's a neighborhood that has been historically redlined. It's a neighborhood where a lot of beloved businesses and residents are being priced out of the neighborhood. If you go on Instagram, you could follow an account called This Side is Hoover, or This Side of Hoover, which documents the displacement that is happening to small businesses in East Hollywood. And so in our initial community outreach with East Hollywood residents concerning this project, a lot of what community members shared was that they wanted to see businesses, certain businesses return to East Hollywood or even stay. So we've done an extensive outreach to different businesses and community members to let them know that we want them to like take space in this new project. And so I feel like this type of advocacy for both projects is something that different communities across the country are currently engaged in. And so if these issues are happening in your neighborhood, know that there are community organizations that are advocating for these kinds of models for to provide spaces for businesses and residents that historically have been disinvested. Sorry. The second model that I wanted to share is the idea of a community land trust. And so the building that you see pictured here is the first community land trust building for East LA. And this was made possible through the pilot community land trust partnership program through the County of Los Angeles, where they awarded $14 million in acquisition and rehab funding to serve 5 community land trusts that serve the 5 supervisory districts across the county. So El Sereno Community Land Trust, Fideicomiso Comunitario Tierra Libre, Liberty Community Land Trust, Beverly, Vermont Community Land Trust, and Trust South LA. And so the idea of community land trusts is that the land trust would hold the ground lease of the land, right? And that the building itself, the community land trust would work with tenants towards ownership of their units, right? And so there's different types of models of ownership. And I bring up this example because East LA is also another organization, East LA is also another neighborhood that is still experiencing the impact and legacy of redlining. And land was never meant to be privatized, right? I wanted to acknowledge that. And when LTSC helped Fideicomiso purchase this property, there were still racial covenants, attached to this building. And so I think there's a movement, there's been a movement, right, as we learned before in the example of co-ops of community ownership where where residents are those who live on the land become stewards of the land. And so I offer a community land trust model as a way to preserve communities. And I know I'm a little over time, but this last model is something that is happening in the Little Tokyo community as well. Something called the Little Tokyo Community Impact Fund, where in addition to building affordable housing, we know that in Little Tokyo, we did research about all the different property owners in Little Tokyo. And the community is pushing for community ownership, community control. And one of the ways of doing that is acquiring buildings in Little Tokyo so that if the community owns a building, they have a say in what rent is charged and also the types of tenants that they want to see. So less Starbucks in Little Tokyo. There's 4 Starbucks in Little Tokyo, and more more businesses with innovative business models like worker-owned co-ops or again legacy businesses that are at risk of displacement. Find a permanent place for their business. And so the idea of a community investment model or community impact fund is similar to the idea of a GoFundMe, where you have people kind of pitch in money for a cause. And so here, this graphic shows that multiple people, individuals, or foundations, businesses invest in a community impact fund where the funds will be used to purchase and stabilize small businesses in the neighborhood, particularly legacy business or other culturally aligned businesses. And so the idea is direct investment. You know where this money is going towards, but you're also stabilizing businesses and encouraging community stewardship and multi-generational ownership, where it's not just about the past, but also like the future of the neighborhood. We want future generations to take ownership of this neighborhood as well. That's it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I think we had a chat question for your name and contact information if you're comfortable sharing that either live or with that person. Okay, and Monique, I think we have you up next. I will share your PowerPoint and let you take it away.
Awesome, thank you so much. Okay, so hi again. My name is Monique, she, her pronouns. I'm a tenant organizer with UHAB. First, I want to say thank you to Sydney and Lindsay for putting this together, and to all the coordinators and staff for this conference. I've been working with HOPE, which I'll talk more about. It's a community group of tenants that I support as staff at UHAB for about 2 years. And so I'm going to talk about UHAB's work with co-ops and then also tenant organizing. So if you can go to the next slide. Awesome. So UHAB is created in 1973, in this moment in time where there's a lot of arson, abandonment, disinvestment in New York City. Landlords are stepping away from responsibility in their buildings in record numbers, and the city is underfunded and doesn't have nearly enough resources to do the repair work necessary. Next slide. And so part of what happens is that there's a movement called Homesteading, or simply of folks coming together to take on the work of rehabbing their buildings at cost to themselves, and trying to get creative through using elected officials and lending programs from the city to build co-ops. And as a result, thousands of tenants become co-op homeowners or shareholders. So this is just an image of part of what that looked like. This is way before my time. Next slide. In 2021, UHAB continues to support that work through member services, preservation, lots of training, lending programs like taking out loans, but also like efficiency programs. And we're grateful to have some of this documented on our website, just lots of archival material from this time. So while the roots of UHAB remain in training, it's also expanded to a lot of other programs. And then in the 2000s, it's also expanded to tenant organizing. You can go to the next slide. So while UHAB is known for its co-op work, they've also been organizing tenants since the 2000s. How I see it as is the fight for housing justice has to include everyone and folks in every kind of housing situation. So we're trying to build this movement together of folks in co-ops, private homeowners, but also tenants, folks who are homeless, houseless, folks who are on vouchers, really just coming together to build a stronger housing movement. So we know that when tenants come together with their neighborhood to fight for structural change and better conditions, it has the power to change the world. And also it creates this spark in them to know that they can change their material conditions, that they have community there with people that they live with, and that change is possible. So I, as staff, work with tenants to create tenant associations in their buildings, but I also support this community group of tenants called HOPE in East Brooklyn. And HOPE stands for Housing Organizers for People Empowerment. We work in Brownsville, East New York, East Crown Heights, and East Flatbush. about 2 years old. And we're still going strong. We have a lot of work to do in this pandemic. So this is an image here of one of our members. Actually, if you go back one, of one of our members who's doing a rally at his building, literally just put his landlord's name, phone number at the bottom and was like, yeah, we're gonna call you because you're trying to evict me. And then in the next slide, this is a protest at one of the buildings that's been on strike, rent strike, since the beginning of the pandemic, going on a year, at 1616 present. And so basically that we understand through organizing, policy, and research that we're working to protect tenants' rights and fight displacement of long-term residents. So that's how I see this connection of long-term housing preservation and also tenant organizing being connected. You go to the next slide. Some of what that has looked like has been historic wins in 2019 of rent law changes. And then even during the pandemic, what that's looked like has been, there's an emergency rental assistance program that folks literally were protesting entirely through the pandemic, which has resulted in about $2.4 billion of city and state money, of state and federal money to pay people's back rent during the pandemic that people can fill out. So we're not just working by ourselves, we work with coalitions. So one of them would be Housing Justice for All and the fight to cancel rent. We also work with Stabilizing NYC. We do environmental justice work as well. National Grid is building a frack gas pipeline in Brooklyn, and many people didn't know that. So we work with the Brownsville Residents Green Committee, which works specifically in Brownsville, to share this information with people and figure out how we can fight that. Anything that's affecting people's housing situations, but like literally where they live, play, work, is a housing issue, is an environmental justice issue, is a health issue, is a racial justice issue. So we're not fighting this fight in a vacuum. It's deeply personal and intersectional. And this last slide is, or the second to last slide, this is an image around political education that we've been doing this summer. So we're also just trying to connect the dots with people too and figure out how we can be more in alignment with each other, even though we have different housing situations, and we can do that in community. So I forget what we were talking about that week. Maybe we're talking about different approaches to social change, but we're also eating food and just really connecting the dots. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of what the work I do looks like. And that last slide is an old image that we don't use anymore, but I think it's really great. It's just representing the neighborhood. You can go to the last slide. Community. Yeah, I think so.
That was great. Thanks so much, Monique. Okay, Camille, you are up. Let me.
All right, hi. So today I'm going to be presenting a project that I've been working on for a while, actually. It's called Vernacular Project, and I have on this front page Building for Conservation. And what that means is creating something that later on can be preserved. In this case, specifically speaking about things that are created by Black people. As I mentioned, I got my master's degree in heritage conservation, but before that, ultimately I am a designer and I do have the background in architecture, and all of that, also brings into account history. And in most of the classes, in most of everything that preservationists do, that architects do, they don't really take into account things created by African Americans. And part of that reason is because there's not a lot that's there already. Like there's just not, and even today, I think it's like 2% of all licensed architects are Black folks. Back in the day, Black people at times did build their own towns, built their own societies and so on, and often they were burnt down or closed down or disinvested in, and so on and so forth. So our legacy is a little bit lacking, to say the least. So with this project, I'm looking at how to build things for us now and how to figure out how we conserve that in the future and making sure that we're making things that are worth conserving for at least 100 years. Next slide. So yeah, this pretty much just explains what I mentioned before. And to be more succinct, Vernacular Project, it explores the dimensions of the Black vernacular in the built environment. And I'm doing that by actually collecting what Black people want to see in the built environment, figuring out what is something that is in common with a lot of Black people and what changes based on demographics, whether it be location or age or what they need or anything else. Next slide. Some of the questions that I'm hoping that this project will answer or begin to answer is, first, what is an African American vernacular? What is something that we all have in common that we want to see in the built environment that we're not seeing already, or at the very least are not seeing in our communities? What happens when we take into account our desires, our needs, and our history? How do vernacular needs affect how future spaces will be designed? How will they be conserved and reused? And how much different is the African American ideal versus popular American ideal? Is there a difference? That's something that we don't know because there isn't really a case study there. How does the input affect public housing? Does public housing cease to exist even when you take into account what we need and what we desire? And the last question, what happens when you ask the same question to Black folks of different ages, classes, gender identities, and sexualities? How do demographics affect this? Next slide. So this started with me being in class and kind of really being bored and being really bad at taking notes. And instead, I withdraw. And there was one history class where we learned about the shotgun house very briefly. And it seems to be the closest thing to an African American vernacular that exists in the United States. And so for the rest of that semester and moving on through the rest of the year, I started looking at and creating little diagrams of how circulation and how the shotgun house could have evolved if we were given the chance really to evolve what our buildings look like from starting from a shotgun house and moving forward. Next slide. After I graduated, I started thinking about that, but on a larger scale. How would other people do this? Because the thing is that, you know, one thing that's really important is that we're not a monolith. So I have my ideas of how style could evolve. I have my ideas about how conservation could change, but I'm only one Black person. There's lots of Black people. So it's really important to get that input from lots of different people and figure out what that looks like. So for this project, I started with a map. And with that map, it has several different spaces that are available to develop essentially case study towns. And those case study towns would include houses that have style that that speaks to us, like style layout diagrams, as well as public spaces that align with what we need and desire. Next slide. This is the map. This was the first one just for placement, and the second one was actually starting to look at what the shapes would be like for these different towns, and they vary in size. This first town is just mine. I figured it would probably be a good idea to work one out just so I could figure out a methodology for bringing it to a larger community, to other people, figure out what kind of questions should be asked, figure out what the input should look like coming in. So this is essentially just the first case study. There's 19 towns on there on that map, or 20. There's 20 towns on that map, so 19 left. And those, I really want to open it up to the community and put people together to figure out what these places look like and collect it all and see what happens pretty much from there. Last slide. And yeah, so I mean, ultimately the goal is to have a collection of towns that create the beginning, because it's not the end, the beginning of a vernacular. And from there, I'm hoping that the collection could be looked at as something to take into account when people are building in African-American communities. If Black folks are trying to create their own spaces, that is something that they can start with and make something that's worth saving. And that's it.
Great, thank you so much. Okay. That was wonderful. I will close this out, and then we'll move on to our discussion. So I'm not sure if I gave my own background. Lindsay, she, her. I'm a dual master's student at USC in heritage conservation and urban planning, and trying to think about how neighborhoods and buildings with a lot of historic significance can be preserved and interpreted in ways that are centered around that longstanding community's history and what their needs are today. So the project that I'll be sharing with you all today is ongoing, and it's a community-wide effort to document 2 Japanese American boarding houses and to protect the rights of the tenants who call those houses home. Like I've said, it's evolved quite a bit since its beginning in the spring, but it's really grounded by a network of people who together have firsthand knowledge about the building's histories, the technical skills and connections to write a designation, and the organizing power to enforce and protect the tenants' rights. The catalyst for me, though, was the day I met my neighbors. So these 2 buildings are on Virgil Ave in East Hollywood, which Carolyn just mentioned, as a historically redlined neighborhood that has a really unique history as a Japanese American enclave, and today is rapidly gentrifying and subject to a lot of speculative development. So in the spring, a local reporter, this side of Hoover, whose name we mentioned below, reported that these 2 buildings had recently been sold. I knew and was aware from my connection with the LA Tenants Union that homes like this with new ownership likely spelled out profit for new owners at the expense of the existing buildings and tenants. So I ran over literally and met my neighbors for the first time, who are about a dozen single Japanese and Japanese American men in their 70s. They told me that after decades of living in this home, here, this one on the left, the new owner was attempting to force them out and convert the buildings. So through local knowledge and historic surveys, these buildings were generally known to be part of the early Japanese and Japanese American settlement in this neighborhood of East Hollywood known as J Flats. The homes were built in 1912 as single-family residents and purchased by Japanese immigrants who built wood frame boarding houses in the early 20s. And these buildings served as housing and employment agents for recent immigrants, mostly single men working as gardeners. And so they're really crucial to an overlooked part of LA's labor history, and are these really tangible manifestations of the ways that Japanese and Japanese Americans formed community and network of support in the face of targeted anti-Japanese policies and practices. And as my neighbors proved today, these houses continue to carry forward their legacy of serving as safe and affordable places for the Japanese American community today. And so here are just some of those themes. And these homes are also significant for one family in particular, the Asawas. Suki Saku and Suyo Osawa immigrated to LA from Japan in the early 1900s and purchased first one of the boarding houses and then both of them. And they grew their business and their role in the community. They had children, which they raised in the boarding houses. And all of that was completely disrupted with World War II when they were forced to abandon their property and incarcerated in a concentration camp in Wyoming. Despite this, with the help of their neighbors, they succeeded in returning to their homes post-war. And in that period, the boarding houses took on a new significance as an anchor to reunite family members and to help their community rebuild. Despite this history, there has been no formal efforts to recognize these buildings. So with the support of 3 different historic preservation organizations in Los Angeles, a local journalist, and both former and current building residents, we wrote a nomination that situated these buildings in this larger context of LA's history, as well as these really pressing concerns around housing affordability and stability today. And the Osawas and the current building resident, who are the historic residents of this building, as well as the current tenants, were really crucial in telling this story. The great-granddaughter and grandniece of Suki Saka and Suyo Osawa shared their personal and their family stories, which really helped us uncover the role of women, Japanese and Japanese American women who were responsible for running the boarding house and really serving as pillars in the community. The current tenants too have a lot of personal knowledge and connection. The oldest has been there for over 4 decades and has seen the neighborhood evolve really dramatically over that time. And so these processes of storytelling went beyond the traditional archives that most preservationists work for, because one, the Osawas were not allowed to own property in their own names, thanks to the California alien land law that prevented Japanese immigrants from owning property, and patriarchal rules that prevented the story of women from being told. We also learned through these about the importance of interracial relationships in the neighborhood between African American and Japanese American residents and Latinx residents as well, thanks to local reporting from this side of Hoover and conversations with these people. And again, these are not historical themes. These are very current dynamics and realities that shape this neighborhood and really offer a path forward. So with the support of the Tenants Union Network, several members and myself began to facilitate bilingual meetings with the residents of the building to educate them about their rights as tenants and help them form a tenant association. So they now lead their own meetings and have contributed really directly to efforts to preserve the building. They understand more intimately than any of us the significance of these places, and despite harassment from their current owner, are determined to stay in their homes. There have been obviously a number of challenges in this effort. While I think that unifying the need to preserve the buildings by designating the buildings and preserving their affordability for the tenants are obviously intertwined, the mechanisms to protect the homes don't protect tenants, and vice versa. So that requires another layer of coordination and labor. Also, I've played a role in convening these groups and writing the nominations, but I don't speak Japanese. I have limited familiarity with the history and historic context, and I'm literally part of the gentrifying force of this neighborhood. So I'm not, to begin with, the ideal person to be leading this, and it's taken time to build rapport and trust and to know who to ask for support. And that part, the organizing and the relationship building, doesn't end, unlike a designation process. So I started this story with myself and how I came to it, because that's the position that I can speak from. And two, I think it also highlights the way that this process has emerged really organically, and its collaborative nature, and this really broad but tightly linked network of people that are really committed to document these building significance in terms of the context today, so that as this neighborhood gentrifies, this history isn't lost, as well as to protect and materially improve the conditions for these residents that carry forward that history. And as Caroline has mentioned, have been displaced multiple times from this neighborhood, and really hold that history within the way they've moved through the space today. So I hope that this demonstrates the potential for partnerships and policy that combine historic preservation and anti-displacement measures, and reinforces the need to displace authorities with technical preservation skills to a supporting role in order to honor the lived experience and history of building residents. Lastly, I think it really goes to show, as Monique has talked about too, the importance of personal connections and building solidarity between neighbors in order to amplify the voices of residents. So I will end there, and we will move into our first Q&A period before we open it up to the audience. So Sydney and I have some questions to share that start around the biggest takeaways that we wanted to pull out from everyone's presentation. Sydney, do you want to start us off with that?
Yeah, sure. All right. I'm going to start off with, I guess, the first one that we developed, which was the presentations today demonstrated how the field of preservation potential can become more intersectional. How can preservationists recognize and integrate different disciplines, methods, or ideologies into their work? Are there particular challenges associated with doing so? And I feel like this is probably a very key question for our group, just because we have a lot of people coming from different backgrounds that are not necessarily preservation oriented also.
Caroline, I know that's something that you've talked about in some of our previous discussions, and as someone who comes, as you said, at preservation from the angle of planning and ethnic studies, maybe you could talk about that process where you realized that all of a sudden what you were doing was preservation.
I feel like within the field of planning, you know, when I went to grad school, I've always like demanded in my classes that my professors incorporate some kind of like, you know, lens of critical race theory, or but you know, not everyone is trained in that, or you know, doesn't believe in it. And so especially like, you know, what's happening in the world today, like critical race theory being banned in schools, ethnic studies being banned. I feel like those are lenses that, you know, people need to learn and to apply in their understanding of history. And I think, I don't know, when I think about, you know, the idea of like, you know, historic nominations and establishing historic districts, you know, was really new to me, you know, when I was in grad school, but kind of seeing how different organizations operate too, and like who they engage. It's not just historical societies, it's, you know, different schools, you know, different local schools, like, you know, from elementary to community college, of engaging folks to provide comments on their designation proposals, or where all the context statements or reports that are written, where are people getting their sources? So I feel like that's, for me, I always ask that, when I come across folks wanting to learn more about Little Tokyo, or wanting to learn more about the neighborhood that I also do some work in historic Filipino town. And I always my first question is like, who have you engaged already? So I think I don't know if that answers the question directly, but that's kind of what comes to mind.
Yeah, I'll add, just to build on that, because I think that's such an important framework. This work isn't theoretical at all. And so once you start talking to people, I don't know, for any of the projects that are happening, getting a sense of like, what is the direction that long-term residents actually want to go in, whether that's small businesses or tenants or like shareholders and co-ops, people in CLPs. Like, what is the direction that the community actually wants to go in is so important, to making sure you're not overstepping and trying to force your vision on someone and trying to preserve something that's not actually, it wasn't the point, it wasn't the center. Yeah, so just seconding everything that you said, Caroline.
Yeah, I think that's really key with, especially with preservationists, because we kind of orient ourselves towards buildings a lot, but without the people living in them or inhabiting them, what point, or like, how is the building historic, right? So you have to center those voices for sure.
Camille, is there anything you want to add from your perspective, from like a design background?
Yeah, actually, I think part of the issue is with preservationists and with planners being open also to accepting new ways of thinking about things. I think a lot of the times it gets hard to even try and accept like integration from, like input from different people, because the rules are so strict. So sometimes it's looking outside those rules and figuring out what actually works best for what they're trying to do and what doesn't work so well, because the rules are very straightforward and therefore very specific sort of things fairly often. I guess one thing in particular, for instance, is the whole thing with integrity, for instance. That's often the barrier for protecting places that are important to people in marginalized communities, because oftentimes those buildings don't have any quote unquote integrity, whatever that may mean to the planner at hand. So sometimes it's, yeah, as said, like ignoring the rules and paying attention to what's actually in front of them.
Yeah, and I feel like that's a great segue, Camille, to another question that we had, which has to do with access and control over land. And I think as all of our presentations have shown, the core issue is autonomy over what you do with your space and how you protect it, and how you have to work against centuries of disinvestment and violence and displacement in order to do that. And so I think this dovetails really nicely with the question that came in as well. Our question was, how might we recognize claims to land and housing that are based in cultural or historic significance rather than formal ownership, when we know that that system has really been screwed from the start. Like Caroline said, land was never meant to be privatized, and it's been done at the expense of BIPOC folks for white colonialists for as long as our country's been around. So how do we look beyond that system? No pressure.
I know, like, talking about ownership, it's very, there's layers to it, right? And when I talk about community land trusts, and when I talk about, tenants being able to own, right, their unit, that's not the case for all community land trusts. I think there are different models of, within the umbrella of like community ownership and community land trusts, where I think the idea is to uplift that people have the right to stay, and depending on the neighborhood, and the people that live and work in the neighborhood, it's trying to create opportunities for self-determination, where if ownership is something that people want, how do we make that accessible? And the building or creating a community land trust is that one avenue, but then maybe there are tenants who don't want to be like owners and want to continue renting, and trying to create a model that serves the needs of different residents in a building. And yeah, I think at the end of the day, it's about self-determination, and it's about the right to the city, the right to stay in neighborhoods that you've helped cultivate, and you've created memories, and you've created relationships in. And how the system is now is terrible. So how do we create opportunities that challenge the system? Like in LA County, for the county to invest $14 million in community land trusts is such a big deal, right? And it's something that people didn't think would ever happen. And now we're in the LA Community Land Trust Coalition, because you have 5 different community land trusts that are purchasing their buildings right now and creating, opportunities for the residents that live in those buildings. And then, working with the residents to figure out, how to improve their living situation, but also ensure, what is it that they need in order to stay? What kind of community do they need to have? Kind of community agreements they need to have to make something like a community land trust work. So I think there's different neighborhoods across the US that have been challenging notions of ownership. Even I feel like community ownership is sometimes co-opted too. Like, so it's like community ownership, we're trying to challenge traditional notions of ownership, but then sometimes that term too can be co-opted by other folks. So I think your traditional, like, single family home, get a mortgage, that's stuff that we're trying to challenge because it's not accessible. And so what are the needs of the neighborhood that you live in or work in, and what does the housing look like in that neighborhood? What does what does investment look like in that neighborhood? And trying to understand like what maybe it may not be that traditional idea of like renter to like an owner, but it's like, how do we make it so that people can stay there permanently for as long as they want to?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. I'm trying to figure out how to like explain my opinion without just repeating everything you said, honestly. But I mean, the main thing with with my project, like the main reason why I didn't put it in an actual space, like I could have, I don't know, I could have taken over the city of Los Angeles and said, here it is, reimagined, but that would have been arrogant. And that's something that planners do way too often anyway, is they look at a place and they say, oh, it's broken, so we're gonna fix it because we know how. And I think that what you're saying about community engagement and asking people what they need and what they want is so astoundingly crucial. And I think that having those conversations on a regular basis with people and knowing that the place that you live in doesn't have to look the way that it does if you don't like the way it looks, which unfortunately for a lot of marginalized communities, they aren't great because there has been a lot of disinvestment. So it's knowing that you don't like the way it looks or the way it is, and then being able to put your input into it instead of having some faceless person say, this is what's going to happen.
I definitely would love to add in also another question we got in the Q&A from Vanessa Chin, where she had asked, how can preservationists who are interested in mitigating displacement merge those two fields closer together and become a liaison, how Lindsay had mentioned, and that kind of ties into what you were talking about, how having that community involvement. And honestly, from my own perspective, kind of demystifying preservation to others and creating education outreach, just because preservation from maybe an outsider view might seem like this very inaccessible thing, but once you kind of break it down, it's something that anyone can do even without formal training to a certain extent. So why not involve those people in the process as well, like Lindsay said, with the communities writing their own nominations.
Yeah, that's making me think about how, like, often when I'm at a protest with other members of Hope, like, the rally cry is often just housing is a human right. Like, everyone has a basic right to stay. And so just the fact that that's not universally accepted, but on its own, is an issue. And then I also think about, like, gentrification, or I think about speculative buyers looking at buildings where disrepair has happened for a long time, and that also being a way that landlords try and push people out. It's just some forces that make it harder for folks to stay. So some of it is just changing, like, what we value. Do we value people staying in their homes? Do we value people having a place to live? And really, like, centering people's basic needs being met. It's about jobs and health and housing and access to water and all of these really basic things. Just that all of that can also be a part of the field as well.
I think a lot of what I've heard from you all could fit under, like, this category of subordinating the field of preservation to a larger cause, obviously, of a housing first model, and a mechanism of stabilization and community empowerment. And then, like Sydney said, providing some tools to work through, like, what this kind of legal aspect of preservation looks like and what some of those rules look like, and then have the discretion for communities to say, this works for us, these three things do and these three things don't, and this building or spot is important to us for all these historic reasons, but we also need to make these changes in order for it to continue to be livable for us, or as a way of bringing preservationists under a coalition and using their expertise as, like, an arm and a tool to a larger goal versus a means to an ends of, like, embalming a structure. Yeah, I think that there's a lot of really great stuff that's come up. We have a couple minutes left. If there are any other questions, thank you again, Kelsey and Vanessa and Caitlin for your questions. Oh, Caitlin, that's great. Because we have maybe this is the question that we can end on. Caitlin says she's a preservationist, or they're preservationists doing tenant organizing in DC. Thoughts about tactics preservation could and should take from organizing. And I think it would be great to speak just a little bit more broadly to the relational strategies that many of you have posed, and how that could connect to different types of intangible heritage that are really intricately connected to the physical spaces people are trying to preserve. Maybe Monique, as our resident organizer, if you want to start us off.
Sure. I feel like a lot of tools and frameworks have been mentioned, like self-determination of people impacted, really just listening to the folks who are there and have been there. I think actually, Caitlin, you might have earlier mentioned a law called TOPA, which is the Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, and that's something we're trying to get passed in New York. But like, I'm working with 2 buildings right now who, you know, the landlord is neglecting a lot of repairs. They've been there long term, and that's something I want to offer, is just making sure tenants know their options. But like, if you don't want a landlord anymore and you simply want to take over the building and you can run it as a co-op and take it out of the market, that can also be an option as well. So maybe some of it is also just thinking creatively about how we can meet the needs of people. Yeah, and to preserve culture, but also that people create culture in community, and really centering people in place. And I'll pass it to whoever wants to take it.
Building off of what Monique shared, yes, you know, how are we uplifting, you know, storytelling, and especially like counter storytelling. And so whatever campaign you're working on, you know, what stories are being told, who needs to listen to them, you know, who's ignored them. And really, I feel like the work that I've seen in Little Tokyo, it's really rooted in storytelling. People are inspired by storytelling. And it's stories that, you know, you don't learn in history class. You don't, you know, it's not a common history you learn about LA. It's not until someone, you know, writes about it or tells their story, or, you know, people are rallying and, you know, in front of city hall or business, and give space for people to tell their stories, where you know, I personally really learned about the you know, the what it is people are fighting for, and what is the vision that people want to see move forward. So yeah, I guess, you know, my thought is on storytelling, whose story hasn't been heard, who needs to hear it.
Yeah, I would agree with storytelling, with the importance of storytelling. I would also say that it's important to keep looking towards the future in preservation, and keep looking on how it can improve and advance. Because part of organizing is figuring out how to make things better for the future, and preservation needs to do the same thing. It needs to be looking forward just as much as it's looking back. And that's what I have.
Great. Well, oh, go ahead, Monique.
Oh, I was just briefly going to say that it's also about power. And just literally, how do we shift power from people who are making a lot of decisions that don't benefit most people to the people who are actually directly impacted by these systems. Because, you know, I'm all for being nice to people. It's definitely how my parents raised me, but being nice to people and kind to people at the end of the day is also not going to make things better. And just preserving culture without also talking about shifting power to people, it also doesn't make things better either. That's all.
Sounds like a great mandate to go out on. Sarah, you're gonna close us out?
Thank you so much for this thoughtful conversation. I feel like all of you truly illustrated ways that preservation intersects with housing justice, and you provided us with actual action items that we can all walk away with and work toward in our communities today. So thank you for giving us your time, expertise, and energy. We really appreciate you joining us all in this virtual space. And if you're in the audience, I highly recommend, if you're looking to explore more conversations on housing, there was a session earlier today called Historical, Not Historic, Destabilizing Historic Preservation Through the Redevelopment of Berry Farm. It was a 10-minute talk, which presented on some housing in DC. And then yesterday, there was a panel discussion called Mass Housing, which was a compare and contrast between Chicago public housing and public housing in the former Yugoslavia, and contrasting different strategies where both of these large-scale multi-unit structures have been preserved. And just thank you everyone for attending the Dismantle Preservation Unconference in general. There's 2 more days left, and we have everything from public history through Beyonce's Lemonade to LGBTQ history, to cemeteries, to environmental justice and beyond. And I hope you all will continue enjoying the event, expanding your brains. And once again, I hope all of you will consider supporting not only the 5 nonprofits identified by Dismantle Preservation, but also the wonderful groups that you are hearing referenced in all of these talks, like the Little Tokyo Services Center. So thank you all for being here, and have a